Welcome to this live stream preview of the upcoming Idaho legislative session. I'm Ian Stevenson, the state politics reporter at the Idaho Statesman. I'm joined today by three Idaho lawmakers: Representative Brent Crane, a Republican from Nampa; Senator Dave Lent, a Republican from Idaho Falls; and House Minority Leader Ilana Rubel, a Democrat from Boise. Thank you to our panelists for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. We already have some audience questions that many of you submitted when you signed up. If you're just now tuning in on social media or on our website, please ask your questions in the comments and we'll get to those at the end of the session. I'm going to start the conversation off today with a few questions, which we'll discuss until about 11:30. After that, I will try to get to as many of your questions as we have time for. All right, so to kick us off, Senator Lent, I was hoping to start with you. Three incumbent senators lost to Republican challengers running to their right this year, and Democrats also lost a seat in the Senate. How do you think the election results will impact the legislature this year, and what should people expect? I think we may have lost Senator Lent briefly. Representative Crane, I'm going to jump to you.
Well, I think first of all, you need to that this is an appeal to put more money into rural broadband. So I know exactly what Senator Lent is trying to do. That is brilliant. But no, I can say this, that the House did shift more to the right, and the Senate did as well. And will that affect policies that are coming forward in the 2025 legislative session? Absolutely, it will. I will let Representative Rubel talk a little bit about the effect that would have, that the more minority lost seats. But it does have an effect when the minority loses seats on a committee. They're not able to have as many members serving on those committees. So I anticipate that you'll see some very conservative proposals come forward this year. I anticipate that you will see the caucuses both shift more towards the right.
I agree with Representative Crane completely. This is obviously a source of considerable concern to me because I think actually it will likely result in less reflective legislation of the will of the people of Idaho. I think the legislature is actually going to be substantially to the right of where the majority of people in Idaho are right now on some pretty key issues. So, for example, Medicaid expansion, hugely popular, passed with 61%. I believe the last poll I saw showed public support of that in excess of 75%. But because of how our closed primary system works, you end up with people getting elected out of a primary election where often you only have 20% of the people voting, and they tend to be the people who are 20% on the furthest right. So you end up with policies like repealing Medicaid expansion, which are pretty unpopular across a broad swath of Idahoans, perhaps very popular in that 20% most right wing that is dominating the primaries. That's one that really concerns me a lot. There's clearly a concerted effort to end Medicaid expansion this session. Vouchers is another one that, again, poll after poll has shown pretty low support for funneling public dollars into unaccountable private schools. This is, again, something that I think is going to have a lot of legs given the current makeup of the legislature. So there are a lot of issues that I think are very much at odds with where your average Idahoan is, but that are probably going to proceed pretty far, if not all the way across the finish line this session, due to election events of this past year.
Yeah, Representative Crane, going off of what you were saying about how you think there are going to be some pretty conservative proposals this year, given the results of the recent election, what are your priorities for the upcoming session, and what are the most significant issues that your constituents you think want to see changes on?
Well, I typically look at the legislative process. Hey, that was perfectly on cue. But I typically look at the legislative process, not what does Brent Crane want to get accomplished? What do my constituents want? And I think the election was Representative Rubel and I probably see this from a different lens, and that's okay. I see that the individuals that I represent want issues like school choice to be talked about. They want issues like Medicaid reform to be talked about. You cannot continue to sustain a program that they were told would cost them around $400 million. That's Medicaid reform, which is pushing close to $1 billion now. And so, what was advertised and now what they bought, people are going, whoa, maybe that's something that we need to take a look at. Will it totally get repealed? I have no idea. But when I approach a legislative session, it's like, what are the priorities of my constituents? What is the art of possible as well in the legislative process? So sometimes letting your constituents know that, hey, that's that idea. I appreciate that idea and understand that that's something that you want. But that is not even going to get a hearing in committee. So I can't, because it's about a 90-day session, I can't spend 20 days trying to continue to push something through when I know it's not even going to get a hearing on the other side. So sometimes it's helping educate your voters as well as to what the reality is of something getting passed in that legislative process. But there will be some big issues. Representative Rubel is right. There will be some controversial issues that will come up, but there is every legislative session. So that doesn't scare me. That doesn't concern me. We will have the debate and then we will cast our votes up or down, and the policy will either move forward or won't.
Senator Lent, I think you're back with us now. We've been discussing changes in the makeup of the legislature, a shift to the right based on the recent election results. And I'm curious how you think the change of the makeup of the legislature might change things in the upcoming session, and also what your priorities or what you think your constituents' priorities are this coming year. Thanks,
and I apologize there. I switched over to my phone. Maybe that'll make a difference. I think, as I look and think about the next session, of course, school choice is there, Medicaid expansion is there. Interestingly enough, Bonneville County was the highest approval rate of anywhere in the state for Medicaid expansion. So I have to be a little careful about the narrative that I listen to there. Certainly it's important. The spending thing has to be under control, but I think digging a little deeper and understanding what's there and the effects it'll have on people is very important. School choice, interestingly enough, our Central Republican Committee did a survey, and overwhelmingly that was not a priority for them. They're focused on things like quality of education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and what can we do to better enable our public system to do that. So another interesting data point coming out of southeastern Idaho.
Representative Crane, speaking to the school choice or school vouchers issue, do you think that the state should pass legislation there? And if so, do you think there should be income thresholds, or how should it be kind of parsed?
So I do. I'm an advocate for school choice. I think that parents should have all options on the table. I think you should put parents absolutely 100% in control of their child's education. And so what that proposal looks like, I have no idea. There is, as Representative Rubel said, there's proposals for vouchers. There's also on the other side proposals for tax credits. So I don't know what will actually happen, but I can tell you, as I told the Speaker of the House when we assessed what had happened in the primary election and the results of that, I said, well, Mr. Speaker, you now have a mandate from those members coming in that they want something meaningful for school choice. That was an issue that a lot of those folks ran on and were able to beat incumbent legislators. But as Senator Lent has pointed out, he comes from an area of the state that maybe it's not something that's important. And that's why helping people understand, this is maybe what you want, but what's the art of possible? And Senator Lent, chairing the Senate Education Committee, is obviously going to have a strong voice into what that looks like and whether it's possible to do this year or whether it's not possible to do. And so that's what I enjoy about the legislative process is you have an idea, people come with strong opinions, and then it's, okay, how does this work through the process? And that's how our founders set it up. It's not easy to pass something through the legislative process. Typically, it takes about 3 years to get something done.
Representative Rubel, I think going off of that, if there is a concerted push this year to pass a school choice or school voucher bill, I know you have a lot of concerns about that. I'm wondering how you look at the issue of public school funding, and are there ways you think there could be a voucher proposal introduced that would not impact school funding or public school funding?
I really don't. I mean, this is a really major concern for us this session, because we look around the country at states that have done this, and I wouldn't call it school choice because Idaho is already a leader in the country in school choice. We have charter schools, we have online schools, we have homeschooling, we have all these things already. What you're really talking about right now is taking on a giant liability for the state, which is cutting checks to the families who are generally very wealthy families who already have kids in private schools. And frankly, it's not about school choice, because I don't believe any of these proposals would suddenly make it possible for a poor kid to go to private school. That's not what this is about. This is about kind of subsidizing wealthy families who are already there. If you're the private schools in my district are $20,000 a year, you cut somebody a check for $5,000, it's not going to allow a poor person to suddenly go to this private school. It just, allows the wealthy families who are already there to upgrade their next trip to the Bahamas. But in other states like Arizona, Indiana, it has exploded their budget. I know there was this talk about Medicaid going over budget. That's nothing compared to what's happened in the states that have adopted really any kind of subsidizing private schools with public dollars. We already have underfunded public schools. The money that was promised to the public education program through House Bill 1 a number of years ago never really made their way to public schools because they changed out of the enrollment model, et cetera. We still have school facilities crumbling. We put some money towards that, but we really haven't solved the problem. We are so far short of meeting our constitutional obligation to adequately fund public education that taking on what will ultimately, I believe, probably end up in multi-hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer liability to subsidize private unaccountable schools. There's no way that isn't going to hurt the public school system. It's coming out of the pot that we count on to fund public schools. And I think it's an extremely dangerous proposal that has backfired just about everywhere it's been tried. And I think this is a can of worms we do not want to open right now. Very dangerous.
I'm going to shift gears in a second, but Representative Crane, I wondered if you wanted to respond to some of those points. In particular, I'm curious if you have thoughts on or concerns about the prospect that Representative Rubel raised of if there is money provided for kids attending private school, will all of that money go towards families that can already afford to send their kids there versus poorer families who might be interested in going to private school, but even with whatever the credit amount is, couldn't afford doing so?
Sure. Great question. And that again, that's going to come up in the debate. And as you begin to craft legislation, it's the art of what's possible. You can sit here today and say, hey, look, I want 100%, let's say it costs $10,000 a year to educate a child in Idaho. I want you to cut a $10,000 check to every single parent in the state of Idaho for every kid they've got. Give them a $10,000 check. Let them decide. That may be someone's idea. But the art of possible, would that pass through the legislative process today? I doubt that it would, even though there's strong feelings for school choice, especially in the House. Can't speak to the Senate. Senator Lent may know where those folks are at. But even though that's what you want to do, and you come there and that's my idea and that's what I'm going to do, you realize as you begin to talk to stakeholders and you begin to talk to school districts and the impact that you have, how is this going to impact your budget? How are you still going to maintain those schools? You realize that you have to all of a sudden make changes to your legislation in order to get it through the process. And you might get it through the process with, okay, it's means tested based on someone's income level in the House. And all of a sudden it trots over to Senator Lent's, side of the rotunda. And he goes, hey, I've got a pretty strong feeling about this. How are we going to backfill those positions? If you take 200 kids out of the school district, how are we going to make sure that school district still gets money so that they can continue to provide a free, fair, thorough, and uniform system of government, which our Constitution allows? So again, it's all about process. That's what happens. People come in with a particular mindset, and then what the end result a lot of times looks a lot different. But I do think, and I told the educators, we met with the Region 3 superintendents last week, and I told them, I said, I'm just telling you, school choice is coming. Whether you like it or not, you can bury your head in the sand and say it's not going to come. But Boise School District told us, they said, we lost 300 students last year. Nampa School District told us they lost 2,000 students. And so for some reason, post-COVID, kids are not going back to the public education system. Parents are looking for other alternatives. And I think that as an Idahoan, I think that we ought to give them every opportunity to pursue whatever they feel like is the best educational model for their child.
All right. Hoping to switch gears here to talk about abortion, and hoping to start with you, Representative Rubel. Many doctors have said that Idaho's strict abortion ban puts women in danger, especially women with serious health conditions. Some doctors have testified about delaying administering health care because fear that they could lose their license or potentially be put in jail What changes do you think should be made to the laws?
Well, I think very dramatic changes need to be made to the laws, but I don't know how optimistic I am that those changes will happen. There have been, as I'm sure most people watching this know, Idaho currently has absolutely no health exception to our total abortion ban. There's a very, very narrow life exception, but you pretty much have to demonstrate that death is absolutely imminent. So things like, chance of death, likelihood of death, loss of a body organ, paralysis, loss of future fertility, none of that can be taken into account, nor can fatal fetal anomalies. So if you have a fetus with no possibility of survival, no skull, no brain, no nervous system, women are still forced to either go to 9 months in Idaho or flee the state to go somewhere else. We've certainly seen that women have had to be airlifted to other states. I heard a report that one of the women who had to be airlifted to another state, by the time she got there, her infection had progressed so far she lost her uterus. We have lost so many doctors who don't want to practice under the threat of criminal penalties for doing their job and carrying out their training. It's very concerning. Previous efforts to introduce a health exception have gone nowhere in the legislature. I know there's an initiative attempt right now to try to put some of those safeguards in place for Idaho women, but it really concerns me. I'm on the Health and Welfare Committee, and I have been for a long time. We work so hard to try to draw doctors to this state. We've been a medical desert for a long time, and I feel like 10, 20 years of efforts to recruit OBGYNs and general practitioners to the state have been completely undone in the past 2 years in terms of, 55% of our high-risk maternity specialists have left the state, a third of our OBGYNs. We can't fill these residencies right now. Nobody wants to come here. It will take us decades just to build back to where we were 2 years ago. And we're digging the hole deeper. It's getting worse with every passing day. Something does need to be done. But if history is any indicator, I don't know that it can or will be done legislatively. I think this might be a case where the only path to safety for women in Idaho is through a ballot initiative.
Senator Lent, Representative Rubel mentioned the lack of a health exception in the abortion bans. Is that something that you feel should be considered or changed at all in the coming session?
I do. And a number of us in southeastern Idaho spent 2.5, 3 hours this last week with 3 physicians. And we held a meeting, called them in and said, we want to be taught really from your perspective what's going on here. And it was very enlightening. And as a result, I think you will see legislation this session that talks about non-viable pregnancies. Representative Rubel alluded to that as well. It makes sense. When the doctors really lay it out and talk about what happens if you don't address these issues for non-viable pregnancies, essentially it terminates the mother's life in many cases. So it was very, very interesting and enlightening. I think and feel strongly that we will see legislation addressing that. And it's already been stated about the issues we're having in meeting with hospital administrators, and they tell story after story of it's so hard to get the OBGYNs in and keep them here. It's getting harder every day. So I think we need to bring some sense of reality back to this issue. I realize it's a very emotionally charged issue, but there are certain scientific things that we need to consider in making this decision.
Representative Crane, regarding, as Senator Lent mentioned, non-viable pregnancies or other health exceptions for abortion, what do you think are the prospects of that on the House side? And do you think there should be any changes made to the laws?
Well, I don't know what the prospects are. This is the first I've actually heard of non-viable, someone talking about legislation coming forward this session. So Senator Lent is the first one to even approach me and say, hey, look, there's the possibility of legislation coming forward with regards to non-viable pregnancies. And typically on something of this magnitude, that when there's a moral underpinning to an issue, it's a highly charged emotional debate. Typically those type of issues get fleshed out early on. We're mid-December now, so that's going to be interesting to see how that process plays out. I can tell you 2 years ago, I spent the bulk of my legislative session meeting with the Idaho Medical Association, meeting with pro-life groups, trying to come up with language that we could agree on for a health exception. And we could not get there. And we tried and tried and tried. And I did meet with OB docs last year One of the disheartening things that is happening is that the legal counsel that represents the hospitals is not being accurate and honest with their OB docs as to what Idaho's current abortion law states. The Attorney General met with me this summer, said he had meetings with CEOs of hospitals. And he said, Brent, I talked with him for an hour before I was finally able to get through to them. You don't understand the law. And what you're telling your OB docs is wrong. And you're scaring your OB docs. There's been no prosecutions at all within the state of Idaho for a doctor that has chosen to perform an abortion because a mother's life was at risk. Not one. And so there is still a lot of misinformation. There are groups that are fundraising off this issue. And quite frankly, there's a lot of work to be done.
What were you talked about having meetings with various groups discussing the potential for adding a health exception. What were the sticking points that you were kind of unable to come to agreement on? Yeah,
so health of the mother, define health of the mother. Is it mental health? Is it emotional health? Is it financial health? That was kind of the sticking point. And if you ever go back and look at what started the whole Roe thing in the first place, it was the issue that in the state of New York, that health of the mother was the venue that was used to drive through abortion on demand. And so amongst pro-life groups, they are hesitant to define broadly health of the mother. So trying to come up with an exemption that works for health of the mother that pro-life groups feel comfortable with, as well as that doctors feel like that they can still perform their duties. That was the challenge, finding the exact language that would work for both groups.
Senator Lent, switching gears now to a law that passed last year. This was Senate Bill 1329, the Parental Rights in Decision-Making Act. There's been some reporting that it's made it difficult for teenagers to receive counseling, or in some cases to get healthcare at school because of the requirement that their guardian's consent be required before that, and sometimes it might be hard to reach the guardian or whatever the particular family situation might be. I wondered if you've been following the kind of results of that bill since it took effect, and whether you think there need to be any changes made there.
Well, I have somewhat, and you're right. It has been a problem for many school districts and professionals there. So it's like a lot of laws that we work on. They evolve the first time out of the gate. And once they hit the road, as much as we try to anticipate what all the angles are going to be, there's always things that come up. And so I think we'll see, I hope we see some modification to that, working with the stakeholders there to get a workable solution, but still meet the intent of the law.
All right, thank you. Representative Crane, switching gears again now, got a lot of topics to get to. There's been a lot of attention in recent months on transgender women in college sports, particularly here with Boise State's volleyball team. Do you plan to support or hear any additional proposals for restrictions on transgender women competing in sports in the state?
No one has let me know that they've got legislation coming forward on that issue. Idaho is a leader on that issue. I coach high school girls basketball. I feel very, very strongly that biological males should not be participating in female sports in any way, shape, or form. But no one has told me that they've got legislation to expand on Idaho's Women's Fairness in Sports Act.
Okay. Representative Rubel, would you like to speak to that issue and what we saw recently with the forfeiture of some games by the Boise State's volleyball team?
Well, I mean, I don't know what else there is to do. I think the legislature passed their ban. So all transgender athletes are banned in Idaho. I don't know if they can extra super duper ban them, but they certainly passed that law. My philosophy on it has always been actually kind of a small government one, where they're all over this in sports. The International Olympic Committee, the NCAA, all these organizations have been studying it and focusing for many years on how to keep sports fair, how to put in rules to keep it fair. I just never felt like it was really the domain of the legislature. I don't think we need to go in and tell them how many timeouts each team should have in a football, game. I don't think we need to tell them they need to move the 3-point line back. I think generally we can let them run their sports and come up with rules that they find fair. They're studying it. They have experts on it. So I guess I'd just like to see government get out of this area and let the people whose area it is and whose expertise it is figure out keep things fair, and I think they can do that. And if they conclude that there's no way that that people who were born male can ever fairly compete, I would respect that decision. But I think we're overreaching by telling people how to run their sports.
Senator Lent, question now about the incoming Trump administration. I'm curious how that might impact the Republican legislature's agenda in the coming year, and I'm curious what you would like to see the next president do for Idaho.
Well, it's interesting. He is I use the word aggressive, but he's not afraid to go after things, and that's what a lot of people admire about him. So I think you'll see that in our legislature as well. You mentioned earlier that there has been a little bit of a shift. I say a little bit of a shift. It's not dramatic. On the Senate side, where we've had a different role historically than the House, I think you'll see a little bit more of the division between the votes, specifically in the Republican side there. But we're working very hard. In our caucus, we're committed to try to come together to understand each other's position and work for what's best for the people of Idaho. And I think as long as we do that, including, you mentioned our new incoming president, I think that's good. Change is good, but it needs to be measured, and we need to always do it in the best interest of the people.
Representative Crane, anything to add about the incoming Trump administration?
Well, he's talked about what he wants to do at the Department of Ed. He wants to abolish the Department of Education. And in meeting with the superintendents last week, one of the challenges that they have is maintenance of effort. So whatever you spent last year with regards to K-12 education, you have to spend that level next year. Well, you got a district like mine, Nampa School District, lost 2,000 students. How are you supposed to continue that maintenance of effort when you're losing students? And so I think, looking at some things like that the Trump administration could do would be very important as far as helping us in the states, not having to worry about, crazy policies with regards to maintenance of effort. If I could get what I wanted, I wish he'd abolish the IRS. I told my brother yesterday, I said, it's not my state taxes that kill me. It's the federal taxes. You're paying upwards of 30% in federal taxes. And here in the Idaho, you're paying, right about 5.8%. So, if we can make it on 5.5%, 6%, I think the federal government could do a lot in just looking at possibly a flat tax and getting away with the IRS.
Okay, Representative Rubel, anything you want to add about shifting from the Biden administration this year to the incoming Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of concerns about the impact this is going to have on Idahoans and on my constituents. I know a lot of my constituents were concerned about inflation and the cost of groceries. Ironically, most economists say that Trump's announced policies, we'll see if he does them, but they're actually likely to drive inflation up to around 7 to 9%, and would cause large spikes in grocery costs and costs of everyday goods. When you deport, and I'm actually concerned about impacts on Idaho specifically, because we're a very agricultural state. And there are areas of agriculture, dairy, and others where 80% of the workforce are undocumented. You deport all the people who are doing all the milking of the cows and the picking of the crops and all that. It's going to cause a lot of financial pain to the agriculture sector, but it's going to drive grocery costs up a lot. Similarly, tariffs, those are going to get passed directly to consumers. So I'm concerned that my constituents who are feeling pain at the supermarket now are going to be feeling a lot more pain if some of these policies are implemented. So that is very worrisome. And another area of great worry I have is on public lands. I feel like there's the most credible threat we've seen maybe in our lifetimes to privatization of public lands in Idaho, which is really what makes Idaho so special and amazing and brings tremendous benefits to our people. There's an effort by the Attorney General right now to basically divest of 10 million acres of public land in Idaho. And I'm concerned about whether the Trump administration is really going to push back on that. I think any previous federal administration would have said, no, the federal government owns this, it's public. I'm not so sure with the Trump administration. We might see record losses of public access to public lands during this time if people aren't vocal to protect these things.
Senator Lent, would you like to speak to Representative Rubel raised deportations, with which President Trump has certainly talked a lot about? Do you have any concerns about if that comes to fruition, how it might affect people in the state, and also how it might affect industries in the state?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting. You go back and look prior to World War I, the immigration that happened from the European area that came in to up to and just past World War I to about 1920. If you compare that numbers wise to what's happened today, that would be the equivalent of 44 million new people coming to the United States. What we're seeing today is the trouble spots in the world are not necessarily Europe. It's more Central and South America. And it bothers me. I listened to something yesterday about Argentina. We talk about inflation rates. They're running over 200% a year. So those and the disruption, the uncertainty in those countries, as it continues to boil, it's going to be a significant issue. So we're a long ways from solving that problem. I'm a believer that immigration is an integral part of our economy, that there is a level of our workforce that has been built and will be sustained based on immigration. It has been for over 100 years, 100 plus years. So I believe that's the case. And to answer your question directly, I think that we have to be very careful about stereotyping people who have come into this country. The picture gets painted in the media about the rapists and the killers and all this stuff. Certainly there's that population in any group of people who are going to come in, but there's also the widowed mother with her two little kids that's just trying to get out of a very, very terrible situation. Most of us aren't aware of just how dire the situation is in some of these countries right now. I think we need to have a little measure of compassion as we go about this.
All right. Thank you, Senator. One more question from me, and then we're going to shift gears to audience questions. Representative Crane, this year lawmakers passed a bill to allow lawsuits against libraries if books believed to be harmful to children are not moved to an adults-only section 60 days after a complaint is made. You heard a lot of bills and proposals related to this in your committee this year. How have you seen this new law functioning since it took effect? And do you think there needs to be any changes? Are you pleased with how it's working?
Overall, fairly pleased with how it's working. I think that you may see the sponsor of the bill, which happens to be my brother, bring a slight tweak to the bill. I think that there was an encapsulation in that bill dealing with private libraries, and he may look to do away with the private library portion of it and just make it public libraries. But I've had no one contact me. I've not had a library contact me and tell me that it's been problematic for them. So that's the only tweak that I potentially know about that I've been privy to that, he's let me know, hey, this is something that I probably want to deal with in the upcoming session.
Representative Rubel, what have you been hearing from constituents about the library bill, and what are your concerns with it?
Yeah, well, I've heard a lot more concern, and we've certainly seen in the news that there are libraries who simply closed access to all minors as a result of the law. My constituents are definitely not happy about the bill. I think certainly we need an improvement if they exempted private libraries. I was frankly really surprised to see that included in the bill in the first place, and that was something that was a subject of debate, to say, hey, I thought we're supposed to be about small government here. Why are we getting in people's business who aren't even accepting taxpayer dollars? Why are we telling them what books that they're allowed to read? There are a number of changes I'd like to see to that bill. Certainly one of the ones that I felt was most egregious was the ban on anything referencing homosexuality. Now, clearly anything, graphic sex acts, I'm fine with, no young child should be exposed to that. But a book with just simply gay characters who are just holding hands, or, kids' books of Heather loves her two mommies, things like that. That is not something that is harmful to children or that should ever have been included in that bill. But it was drafted very broadly to include any reference to homosexuality, even if it's in no way graphic. And it just felt like it was kind of punching down on an oppressed minority group to really no benefit. There's no reason in the modern day that children need to be isolated from the fact that there are gay people in the world. In fact, many of them are in classroom. My kids, since they were in preschool, had other kids in the class who had two mommies or two daddies, or, I think it's time that we normalize that, and that kids learn that there are people in the world who have two mommies and two daddies. And I don't think that should be banned, and that children should be taught from a young age that that's a harmful fact, or something that's so super secret they can't even know that, same-sex couples exist in the world.
Representative Crane, would you like to respond to that? Do you feel that
Sure.
The broadness of the law and how it was crafted in potentially including not just graphic sexual activity, but also depictions of gay characters. Was that how it was intended to include those groups, or not?
Well, the law was tied to the obscenity statute. And if you violate the obscenity statute, and that those provisions are inside the obscenity statute. So that's how the law was crafted. If it violates the obscenity statute, then you're violating the law. And so that's my interpretation of it. I mean, Ilana and I might sit here and try to parse hairs over it, but the fact of the matter is, you go look, it's tied to the obscenity statute, and she knows that.
All right. Yeah. Go ahead, Representative.
Right. I think that what the problem was, I think we have a very outdated obscenity statute because it did contain that language, but I think it really made it far more egregious than taking that flawed language, which we've tried to fix and we have not been successful in getting a hearing on it, but then taking that language and going nuclear with it across the whole state and saying now that was in that one obscenity statute, we're now going to apply that to every library and say that nobody under 18 can access a book with a gay character. That was not something that was in the law before. That is something that was created by the House bill that was passed last year. So this is going far beyond, I think, what the state of the law did prior to that.
Ian, if I could weigh in just a bit on this, Ilana,
Sure.
You sit on the Judiciary Committee. You guys set the policy for what the obscenity statute says. If you
I was not on the Judiciary Committee.
You have served on the Judiciary Committee.
Never been on it.
Okay, well, you have members on the Judiciary Committee, and you're the minority leader. So if you have objections, you're an attorney. If you have objections to the obscenity statutes, bring the bill to change the obscenity statute. The fact of the matter is, this bill, the library bill, was tied to a violation of the obscenity statute, and you know it. And so to go out there and try to message otherwise to Idahoans, I don't appreciate it, and I find it patently dishonest to do so.
Brought that bill, couldn't get a hearing.
Well, that's not my problem. That's not my committee. But you have members on the Judiciary Committee. You're a member of the minority party. And if it's that big of a deal to you to change the obscenity statute, bring the bill and talk with Representative Skog, who chairs the committee.
All right. Going to shift gears now to audience questions. Senator Lent, I think I'll start with you on this one. This is a question from an audience member. What are your plans to prevent cuts in health and welfare, Medicaid, and other programs helping seniors, disabled people and their families, and non-family caregivers?
So that I don't know if that question was directed directly to me or just to the group, but
just generally, yeah.
Yeah. So my wheelhouse has not necessarily been those subjects. I've been on JFAC for the last 4 years, and then of course education is where I spend most of my time. But certainly, those of us who are of a reasonable age, I guess, are very sensitive to that issue about cutting any benefits there. So I would preserve everything we have and try to do so. I mean, if that's the question that's being asked, what would I do there? My approach would be to preserve what we have and not let that erode. As we see inflation continue to drive, fixed income becomes more and more important in our state. Homeowners exemption, all those kind of things come into play. So I have to always think about the widow lady that lives down the street from me, and how am I being a good steward of her tax dollars that are going in, and how am I helping to protect her from an economy and from a government system that makes it so that she eventually has to sell her home for no reason other than she just can't pay her bills on her fixed income. So for me, I feel very strong about protecting that particular group.
Thank you. Would other two panelists like to weigh in on programs like Medicaid that for seniors on fixed incomes, or other groups? And the Representative Crane, you also mentioned the potential of changes to Medicaid in the coming session.
I do think that there will be changes or attempts. Let me put it that way. I think there will be attempts to change Medicaid expansion, to reform Medicaid expansion. What those look like, I don't know. My morning committee is state affairs, health and welfare. House Health and Welfare meets in the morning as well. So I don't work those issues. I work state affairs issues. So I couldn't give you a definitive answer as if there's policies coming forward this year that would address this individual's concerns.
Representative Rubel, you're on the Health and Welfare Committee. Would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I am. I have a lot of concerns about whether we're doing adequately by our most vulnerable citizens and those with disabilities. Senator Lent and I have both served on JLOC and seen some of the reports that come from the Oversight Committee on that. There was not a dry eye on the podium when we got the report on the state of the workforce help, basically, for these folks. These are people many with severe disabilities, people with cerebral palsy, blind, people who need a great deal of help, even to just go through the basics and bathe and get food and go to the bathroom. And the state is obligated, at least under current law, to provide the help so that they can survive. And we were undercompensating so badly they couldn't find anybody to do this work. And I remember kind of openly weeping up on the podium when I was hearing about one particular guy, blind with cerebral palsy, who was abandoned for so long. He developed bed sores that got infected. It was really horrible. We need to be looking after these people better than we are, and certainly not worse than we are. We cannot. We have already cut to the bone on these programs, and we got to do better. But I will certainly fight any cuts to any efforts to help these folks.
All right, a question about, and I'll leave this open to whoever wants to jump in. What are we going to do about Idaho's increasing lack of housing affordability? Anyone have thoughts on that topic?
Oh, I'd be happy to. That is actually one of our caucus's top priorities this session. A few years ago, we put for the first time ever some money into affordable housing. There's been actually an affordable housing fund, in quotes, because it never had money in it. It was created statutorily decades ago, but never had a penny put into it. 3 years ago, I want to say, for the first time ever, we put $50 million into it, and it was leveraged substantially. It was kind of an effort to help subsidize and bridge the gap for developers who were willing to build affordable housing. I think it was very successful and created thousands of units of affordable housing, but then it was left there and hasn't been funded ever since. I hear about this issue as much or more than any other issue from my constituents. I know it's a real pain point for many citizens of Idaho, and I would love to see us put at least a little bit of money back in that fund, because I think it was a great way to have a little bit of money go pretty far toward finding affordable housing for the many Idahoans who need it.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I jump in on that just for a second. I step back and say, what's the investment we're making to keep us away from having that problem in the first place? Affordable housing in first, that people can't afford the payments to be in there. So I look at things like Launch that takes those students or those citizens that are having such a hard time getting jobs that allow them to make these payments, to live in normal middle-class housing, and provide them with the knowledge, skills, and abilities to let them progress. We're fortunate that we had 3 years of the adult launch program to benchmark and leverage that against what we've done in the last couple of years with the full-blown launch program. So I'm excited meeting with institutional leaders across the state and seeing the impact that's having, the popularity of that as it moves forward. And most importantly, as Idaho is projected to grow 13% or so continually over the next 10 years, we have to have folks who can fill those jobs. And the people moving to the state aren't necessarily those people. At the same time, when our young people move away from the state for jobs, that industry that's coming to our state, we need our citizens that have the knowledge, skills, and abilities, not only to fulfill those jobs for our economy, but for them personally, so that they can live middle class and above lives based on their incomes.
Thank you, Senator. We've also got a question about Idaho's grocery tax. I've seen a lot of discussion about this in recent weeks online. I guess for some background for listeners, Idaho's grocery tax is currently set at 6%, and then residents get a rebate for food expenses off of their tax bill. But it's not currently indexed for inflation. And so this person is talking about the high cost of groceries and how they live near the border with Washington, which has no sales tax. And they know many people who do their food shopping across the river as a result of that. So should the tax be indexed to inflation, or should the grocery tax be removed entirely? Anyone want to take that topic up?
I'll dive in just quickly again. I know both the representatives want to speak to this as well. Grocery tax is so interesting because the more you get into it, the more complicated it gets. I've been against the grocery tax from the beginning However, I do see some benefits from it. My concern would be if we do away with it, how do we know that directly will cause a decrease in prices at the delivery, at the point of purchase? We don't. And that's my concern, is that even if we do away with it, are they actually going to see the benefit in the end?
Yeah, I generally I've always been for getting rid of it. Although I can see benefits to approaching it another way. I know there's been the argument that hey, if you do it with a rebate, then it's good because then you get the out-of-staters paying the grocery tax, but residents don't. But I think you also have a lot of Idaho residents who just don't submit tax forms, and so they don't get those rebates, so they pay it without ever getting the rebate back. I'm open to anything. I certainly think it should be indexed to inflation, because when we don't index things to inflation, they just sit for many years with people really paying, more than they should and not getting the rebate that they should be getting until the legislature gets around to it 5 years later to actually increase the rebate to where it should be according to inflation. I think it would be fairer to citizens to just have it automatically indexed so that they're always getting an increase in the rebate that correlates to where inflation is right now. I think we probably should do that with a lot of things in state law, just indexing it to inflation so that we're always staying current and we don't have outdated numbers that we're either collecting or having people pay. So I think an indexed rebate would be a great idea.
Representative Crane?
Yeah, Senator Lent and Representative Rubel have both raised some important points around the discussion around the grocery tax credit. When I ran 18 years ago, I said I would vote to repeal it. And so I would stand by that promise. I made that promise when I ran, and I feel pretty strongly about if you've made a promise to your constituents, you need to follow through on that. I do think indexing is one way you could deal with it, but the problem with this issue, candidly, in the House of Representatives is that it has gotten a bad reputation with regards to it. It was introduced as a personal bill several years ago, and then an attempt to draw it out of a committee where everybody knows whenever you introduce a personal bill, and Ilana and her caucus are very familiar with introducing personal bills, it's simply to get notoriety around an issue. It's not ever to actually see that bill move forward in that legislative session. And so there was a representative that I think 17, 18 times continued to try to draw this bill out of the committee and really tarnish the reputation of the issue. And people don't think about that a lot of times, but when you work on issues also get a reputation. And there is a lot of animosity around this issue. And so as far as getting something meaningful done, as far as removing it, I don't think it's going to happen. If you want to talk about indexing, I think that's probably a more likely path that I would see in the next legislative session.
All right, a question about the Idaho's death penalty. Given a failed execution in February, the cost and difficulty in obtaining lethal drugs, which then expire, and also the cost of paying for the new firing squad facility that the state's working on building. How do you feel about abolishing the death penalty in Idaho? Anyone want to speak to?
Yeah, I'll start.
Sure.
I would not vote for that piece of legislation. I do believe there are some crimes that warrant a death penalty, and so I would not vote for that legislation.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Representative Rubel, go ahead.
Actually, I personally don't, I guess I tend to agree that there are some crimes that are so heinous. I don't have a moral problem with applying the death penalty in those cases. Certainly, the murders in Moscow come to mind on that front. I'm not sure. Cost effectively, I think it ends up costing you in excess of $1 million in appeal every time you have a death penalty case. I think probably a lifetime in prison might cause more suffering than death. My understanding right now, I voted against the firing squad because while I'm in the right circumstances, I'm okay with the death penalty. I feel like firing squad is kind of a bridge too far. I think that's been found in the past to run afoul of the 8th Amendment on cruel and unusual punishment. Somebody sent me pictures of the last firing squad execution in Utah, and it's just something that grotesque is something I'm really not comfortable government being part of. I know there's an effort right now to upgrade the facility so that they can do deep vein IVs so that they don't run into the problem they had with the last execution where they couldn't find a vein. I feel like that's probably the answer, is to get a more reliable system of lethal injection. But I think they're on the path to working on that right now.
Senator Lent, would you like to speak to that?
Well, I would agree with Representative Crane there that from my position, it is a cultural thing, and there are certain things that do warrant a forfeit of a life. Unfortunately, the government has to be the person or the entity that does that. But I would continue to support the death penalty.
All right, thank you. We've got a question now, and Representative Rubel, you raised public lands earlier. This person's asking about the lawsuit out of Utah trying to return control of lots of federal lands to the states. Attorney General Raul Labrador has said he supports that lawsuit. How do you feel about that lawsuit and the effort to bring federal lands in Idaho back under the control of the state?
I think it's an incredibly ill-advised lawsuit, and he's actually added Idaho to it, so that, if they become the dog that catches the car, then I believe it applies to Idaho as well, and we would lose our public lands. I think there's been a lot of very misleading talk around this. What is never going to happen is that Idaho just gets these lands for free. All of a sudden, IDL has it and they do wonderful management and everybody's happy and they still get to go hunting and fishing where they always did. That is never going to happen under this lawsuit. First of all, we could never afford it. There's been a lot of talk about that. It would cost us hundreds of millions of dollars in maintenance and firefighting, even if we got it. But I don't believe this land would ever come to state control in the first place. I believe there is only one outcome from this lawsuit, and that is privatization of this land. It will be sold to billionaires and no trespass signs will go up. And the places that you are used to going with your family and fishing and hunting will no longer be accessible to you. I see no other practical outcome to this. First of all, there's federal law on how you dispose of this. So if they win this lawsuit, it's not like the federal government says, here, have 10 million acres for free. They have to get fair market value for this land, which would be billions of dollars. So Idaho would never have the money to afford to buy these lands in the first place. And if they did, they would never have the money to maintain it and do firefighting on those. So there really is no credible scenario in which anything happens but sale of the land, and the only people that are going to have the money to buy this kind of land are shell corporations of foreign countries, billionaires, etc. It is essentially the privatization of our treasured public lands. And it bothers me greatly that this is something that Idaho is currently seeking to have happen. I think this is something that crosses all party lines. Everybody in Idaho loves their public lands. Cecil Andrus always called it the second paycheck that Idahoans get. They want to get their paycheck from their job, and then they get to go out with their family and explore the mountains and rivers and hunt and fish. That could all be coming to an end if this lawsuit prevails. I think we need to pull the plug on this lawsuit right now before we become the dog that catches the car. We should not be asking for this to happen. We should be begging for it not to happen. And right now, your taxpayer dollars are paying for an effort to try to privatize our public lands, eliminating the legacy for our children and grandchildren. It needs to stop now. We need to pull out of this lawsuit.
Anyone else want to take up that question?
Well, I probably see the world just a little bit different than Representative Rubel. These are Idaho's lands. That's how I view them. They're not the federal government's lands. They're Idaho's lands. And I would prefer that Idahoans own their own land. I agree with you, Representative Rubel. I do not want to see the land privatized. I think it is a public treasure. And I think that the state of Idaho can manage it. And I think that Idaho officials would beg to differ with your opinion. I think Idaho officials do a better job managing their lands and keeping forest fires down. I think that the statistics would point out that Idaho does a better job than the federal government at that. And I would just assume Idahoans that you can drive to Boise and talk to them about what's going on Idaho lands. I think that's a much better approach than 3,000 miles away in DC. People that have no connection to Idaho at all are telling us what to do with our private lands. So there is some commonality that we have on it. Representative Rubel and I both agree we don't want it going into the hands of billionaires, but I don't want it in the hands of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. either.
All right. We've got a question about Idaho's new voter ID laws. This is House Bills 124 and House Bill 340. This questioner is saying that the percentage of registered 18 and 19-year-olds went from a 66% increase from 2018 to 2022 to a 23% decrease from 2022 to 2024. The Ada County Clerk also reported this year having to turn away some legitimate voters because of issues with people meeting the registration requirements related to the ID requirements for registration. Do you think any of these new laws need to be tweaked or changed?
I don't, candidly. The intent behind those laws was to ensure that Idaho residents have proof of residency, that they live here and that they are an Idaho resident. and making sure that we know who is voting. If anything, you're going to see Idaho continue to strengthen their election integrity aspect of this. These are college kids, and they're wanting that these college kids that are here for 3 months, maybe 6 months out of the year to vote in Idaho elections. And so this was an attempt brought by folks from Northern Idaho to say, hey, look, there are problems on the campus of the University of Idaho. They're exploiting this, and we want to make sure that these kids are residents, that they are living here. They're not just here part-time. And so I think the law did exactly what it was intended to do.
I guess I would respectively profoundly disagree on that point. And I have BSU in my district, and I'm very concerned that they be able to vote. I think these laws went way too far and stopped probably thousands of perfectly legal citizens who are Idaho residents from voting. They put on extremely draconian requirements that a lot of students, frankly, not just students, adults can't meet. I don't think my mother, who had, born in the United States, never committed a felony, perfectly legal person, she could not have registered to vote under these laws. They require documentation that a lot of people simply don't have. I paid for my mother was very poor. I paid for her rent. I paid for her utilities. She did not have a lease or a utility bill in her own name. And so I don't know that she could have produced the documentation under these current rules to be able to vote. But it has been a huge problem. As you noted at the outset, it's caused dramatic drops in youth voting, where we went from a 66% increase before to a 23% decrease just between 2020 and 2022. In Moscow, there were 5 to 7 hour lines, and most people left without voting. Because the lines were so egregious, because it was so hard to register and it took so long. These laws have effectively made it impossible for perfectly legal people to vote. And I don't think that's what we want to do. And I think we want young people voting. If they're here and they're legal and they're citizens and they're residing here, I see no advantage to stopping them from voting. And, so they're not going to have a driver's license at their address that maybe they're only at 8 months. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be able to vote. So I think we need to make it possible. Absolutely, only citizens should vote and only residents should vote. But that doesn't mean we should make people have to leap through hoops of fire that they can't do just to be able to vote. Nonpartisan registration groups have found, who try to register students on campus, that 20 to 35% of the people they talk to who are citizens and residents cannot register because they can't meet the documentation requirements. I don't think that's right, and I think it undermines voter integrity. I think you actually have less integrity when you've cut thousands of people out of the process who should be able to have a voice.
Ian, let's not forget, men and women have died, shed their blood for us to have the right to vote. It is a sacred right and something that should not be taken lightly, period. The provisions in that law says that you can use your driver's license, a state driver's license, or you can go get a state issued ID, and you have to prove that you are a resident of the state of Idaho. You know what? In order to get on an airplane, you got to have a valid ID. And to go into the voter's booth and to exercise this sacred right, you should have to have a valid ID. I don't think it's a bridge too far. I think we found that there was a loophole that was being exploited, and we closed that loophole.
All right.
I would just add to that, if I could just very
go ahead, Senator.
I agree with Representative Crane there, but voter integrity is a essential element of trust that we have to maintain and ensure carries forth in our system here. So I support that. I agree that it's a privilege, and if the law is not working for some, then we need to look at it to make accommodation for that. But the principle needs to remain there, that only the people who should be voting are voting.
Oh, I agree with that. I just think the people who should be voting should be provided a reasonable path to being able to do so.
And I don't think it's unreasonable to show a voter ID. Again, to get on an airline, there is nobody there. There is, men and women have fought for this right. I mean, it is a sacred right. It's a fundamental right. And you don't see Idaho headlining the news with all the election disasters, all the questions about integrity about Idaho elections. You don't see that. Well, there's a reason why you don't see that, is we take that job very seriously in Idaho. We want to make sure that the electoral process is one that the citizens of Idaho have the utmost confidence in. And so for you to show either a government issued ID, which was free, or your driver's license, a valid Idaho driver's license, I don't think is a bridge too far at all for people to vote in the state of Idaho.
I think the problem is that you don't have to bring a property tax bill to get on a plane. But
Representative Crane, I guess on that point, do you think that students attending the University of Idaho or Boise State should not be voting in Idaho if they are from out of state, or
Well, yeah. You're going to ask my personal preference on this, right? And I'm going to give you my personal preference. I want people that have a vested interest that are living here. Someone that's going to come in for 6 months out of the year and then elect leaders that I've got to live with for the next 2 years, I don't think is good. I think it is people that have put down roots here, people that are paying property taxes, people that are paying income taxes, people that have a vested interest in the state of Idaho, not kids that are blipping in, blipping out. Hey, I may be at the University of Idaho. Oh, hey, they got a new football coach, so I'm transferring. I'm going somewhere else. Those kids casting votes, I don't think is who you want deciding elections. That's a personal opinion.
All right. Well, thank you all. We are out of time. Thank you again to our panelists for joining us, and thank you to all of you for attending and for engaging with politics and civic issues in Idaho. If we didn't get to your question, please don't think that we didn't hear it. We use your questions or concerns for events like these, or those emailed into our newsroom as tips to inform our coverage. I and my colleagues will be covering the issues we've just discussed and many more during the upcoming session, so please follow along. You can support important conversations like these and stay up to date on what's happening in our state with a digital subscription to the Idaho Statesman. Idaho's next legislative session begins January 6th. Have a good weekend and holiday season, everyone. Thank you very much.